I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, The Gospel According to John, an encounter with grace and truth. Today we'll be talking about Lesson 5 of our study, which covers the Gospel according to John, chapter 4, verses 1 through 54. In our previous lesson, we saw an encounter between Jesus and one of the leaders of the Jews, Nicodemus. And that will be useful to make sure you remember some of the details of as we get into this lesson, because we have here set up a very deliberate contrast between that encounter and this one, which we'll talk a lot about as we get into it. For now, just remember, Nicodemus was last time. This one is a different thing, and we're on purpose looking at them together to get a fuller sense of what the author is trying to tell us. But we'll get into that here in a little bit. For now, we're setting the scene. We see an interesting thing. Jesus has to leave town. Again, he does not spend in this gospel the majority of his time in and around Jerusalem. He spends a lot of his time up to the north. And here he takes off to the north, and we see why is that he's getting attention, and it's not all positive. When the Jewish leaders find out that he's drawing a lot of attention, he gets concerned about where that's going and decides to split. There's also a very interesting thing here. We didn't talk in the last lesson when it talked about Jesus baptizing about what the big deal with that was because of this, which then highlights Jesus baptizing means Jesus' disciples baptizing, not Jesus baptizing. Why is that important? In this gospel, we will see later references to the baptism of Jesus, but note, if you remember back, Jesus was not actually baptized by John in this gospel, nor is Jesus baptizing anyone. Why? What the word baptism means is a submersion and then a coming back out. That whole thing is, the water form is a sign or a symbol of a different reality, of descending, going down into death, and coming back out. Jesus' baptism is his death and resurrection. So he is ultimately baptized in his death and resurrection. And the baptism of Jesus that John talks about, I'm baptizing you with water, he'll baptize you with the Spirit, is actually joining in that death and resurrection of Jesus, which we can't do until he's died and resurrected. So the baptism of Jesus and all of that new rite of Jesus is a thing that isn't open yet. It's not available yet for anyone because Jesus hasn't done the thing that institutes it yet. So Jesus is not baptizing. There's also worth mentioning, just as means of reflection, how this whole baptism thing came to be set up. Because it comes about in two parts by two people that are very important that lead to it being the entry rite into life in Christ and Christianity. You've got John the Baptist, and then you've got Jesus. John was not unique. This baptism thing, he didn't invent. It was a thing that sort of happened as an extension of purification rites. And it wasn't new when John did it, but it got a lot more attention. And it was sort of legitimized as this means of, if you remember, and it's not in this gospel, so if you don't, no points off. It's not on the test for John. But if you remember in the Synoptic Gospels, why John says he's baptizing It's for repentance and the forgiveness of sins. The forgiveness of sins, that's a new step. You can, in these purification rites, you can kind of wash away forms of uncleanliness, but there were still pretty strict rules about how sins are forgiven. And I use air quotes because, of course, people stay dead in their sin. You could kind of push away some of the most immediate wrath of God for your sins, but you couldn't solve the problem of death, which is a thing that Jesus is here to do. But the idea that baptism is a means through which sin is actually forgiven, that was a little newer and kind of a thing that John gets credit for setting up. But though John set it up, it was Jesus who made that truly possible. Right? With John, I could go and I could confess my sins and I could be baptized, and I could feel better about myself. But at the deep level of who I am, nothing different was achieved. I didn't change as a result of being baptized. Jesus did that, and it's through his baptism, his death and resurrection, that was achieved. And here we see the first example of a very fascinating thing about our sacraments. In the Jewish tradition, the important person in these rites was the person doing it. Right? You've got a priest who goes in before the altar or into the Holy of Holies and asks forgiveness for all the people. You've got a priest who is a necessary part of offering a sacrifice for the forgiveness of sins. And yeah, your sacrifice is your part, and that's somewhat important, but all of those sacrifices were interchangeable. And the critical and essential element was the priest who offers that sacrifice. Jesus changes the emphasis and the focus on those things. Like we've seen elsewhere here in this gospel, we've seen him showing up and saying, no, I'm not Moses. I'm the serpent on a stick. I'm these things and not these people. Here he's putting himself in the place of the baptized. He's putting himself in the place of the sacrifice. He's not the one doing the priestly function. He's the one having the priestly function done upon. And through that we all share in the result of that. While in that sense, John is serving the priestly, although baptism didn't necessarily require a priest, is serving kind of the ministerial priestly function here of setting up baptism, and is building the infrastructure of this new rite. But John is not capable of giving it its power because it doesn't come from the minister, from the priest. And it's not through John's baptism that this new rite takes on its power. It's when Jesus is baptized in his death and resurrection that this thing that John was doing becomes a fundamentally different thing. As John himself tells us, my baptism is, I'm just sprinkling water on you. It's great that you're interested in this, but all I'm doing is pouring some water on you. You should be looking at, there's going to be a different form of this, where you are instead submersed in the Spirit, and you do that by joining with Jesus as the one baptized, and not as the one baptizing. And it leads to, in Christianity still today, there's a strong de-emphasis on the one performing the rite, on the priesthood, and a strong emphasis on that which is being received, which is where Christ is present and acts. Christ is present with us as we are baptized, not as the one baptizing. Christ is present with us in the Eucharist as what we receive. Christ is present in all of these things, not as the one doing, but as much. But of course he's involved in that, right? I'm not saying he's not involved in that, but the object rather than the subject becomes much more significant in our sacraments. And it starts here with baptism. And it starts here with John set up the rite as the doer, but the receiver is where Christ is. And that starts not here with this rite, but with his death and resurrection. And that's why it seemed important to the person writing this gospel to emphasize, well, first to leave out any mention that Jesus was baptized by John, because that would be an empty rite. It wouldn't have meant anything yet. Well, and to emphasize here and later that Jesus isn't baptized, and that later in his death and resurrection, that's where that will happen. And that's what we are all joining into in what happens. And we'll see a similar thing here in a couple of chapters. It'll be worth keeping this framework of thought in mind as we roll into John chapter 6, which, you may already know, that's kind of a big deal from a Eucharistic point of view. We want to keep the same kind of thinking about Jesus' role in a sacrament as we go into that. And I think it'll help us make a very clear sense of what's going on there as well. So that's our setup here. Jesus is going back up north because he doesn't want to draw too much attention from the Jewish leaders. On the way up north, as Jesus is journeying, they ended up passing through the land of Samaria. Historical context, when the northern kingdom of Israel was conquered, the people were largely just deported and interspersed among other peoples. So you have some former Israelites in Samaria, but you have a lot of people from a lot of other backgrounds, and that led to a mixing of various religious backgrounds and traditions, and a fairly extreme diluting and watering down of that view. Not that the Israelites necessarily were doing so hot with it, even when they just had that, which is part of the reason for the deportation to begin with. If you did the King studies and prophet studies, then you will be full aware of that history. But Samaria is what's left there in the north, and they end up passing through. And here we set our scene at in an area that is described as being significant from a point of view of Israel as the whole, like Israel as Jacob, Israel. Here is a well that was rooted in the tradition and history of Jacob and his favored son Joseph, which is an interesting backdrop to keep in mind here. It will come into play, so it's worth thinking again, what is it about this land? Are these people God's people or are they not? Because at the time, the Jews really were pretty anti-Samaritan and stuck their nose up at them really entirely. And based on their worship practices, that sort of makes sense. They certainly weren't trying to follow all the law as it had developed and evolved. They missed everything that happened in exile and back from exile, and they had these other traditions in muddying the water as well. But there's an interesting question of who is God's chosen people? The people themselves and kind of self-selected, this remnant that ended up coming back from exile of Judah was God's chosen people now. They're the ones he brought back. But nowhere did God make a new deal that said, I'm actually canceling my promise to all these other people. And I don't care about them anymore. That's the thing that people read into and interpreted into what was going on, just based on events that happened. But there's really not any precedent that God thought the same way that some of his people thought. And so rooting this scene with Jesus in the context of something connecting back to Jacob is a thing that, just by the nature of where it is, should be raising a question for us in our minds of who is God's chosen people. And that will be an interesting and a relevant thought that's important to keep in mind as we try to interpret this scene. Again, especially in contrast, we just saw Jesus talk in the previous lesson in the chapter with someone who certainly would believe that he is of the elite of God's chosen people, the ones who are left, one of the leaders of the Jews. And he would definitely think that his limited group are the ones who are now inheritors of the promise. And we see how that kind of narrow mindset of how that view is narrowed to a specific set of beliefs even puts him at odds with Jesus and Jesus' message. So that idea of being chosen creates a conflict for him with accepting something new and outside, and is potentially part of what's at play in his inability to accept Jesus or to fully recognize and realize him. How can you, this just guy who's not one of the Jewish leaders by birth or caste or education, how can you presume to be teaching me? I'm one of the chosen ones. You can't possibly have anything to say from a teaching and a law point of view that I don't already know. You might be a prophet and you might be able to, I don't know, show me God or something. It's so unclear what it is even Nicodemus was expecting, which is why he didn't get that much. Anyway, contrast is important. So here Jesus runs into a Samaritan woman. It's worth, again, commenting a little bit on translation. This happens at the 6th hour. A lot of people have said that this 6th hour is noon. And the reason that they have said that is the Synoptic Gospels in general follow a Jewish clock in terms of accounting when stuff happens. And the 6th hour, it's kind of based on when you wake up. And roughly 6 hours after when you likely would have woken up with the sun is going to be around noon. And that, in the Synoptic Gospels, would be accurate. But the Gospel according to John, as we'll see much later when we get to the Passion, and we see the time of Jesus' death, is especially where this becomes clear, follows the Roman time, which is the same as ours. So the 6th hour is 6 o'clock. Probably in this case, although they wouldn't have called it such, p.m. in the evening. So I think it makes much more sense to anchor this story in terms of how timing in John works, to anchor the story at 6 o'clock at night. They've been traveling all day. They have come to the end of their travel. It's dinner time. They're hungry. Jesus' disciples go off to get some dinner. They're ready to settle in for the day. You're not going to stop your traveling for the day at noon. You're going to lose most of your traveling time. So just in general, it intuitively makes more sense, I think, that this is evening as well. But just keep that in mind. So any of the things you've heard about what this story means and what it means about this woman and her place in society and some of those things, because this is happening at noon, or if it's not happening at noon, are not applicable. So evening, we're going to say this is happening in the evening. Again, Jesus' disciples have gone off into town to buy some food, so Jesus is alone. An odd thing in and of itself. How does it come that there are a decent number of these people? How does it come about that they would all willingly just leave Jesus by himself? But it is not the only time that they do that. It seems to have been fairly standard that we all go off one way and leave Jesus alone for a while. Very possibly at his request. He could have gotten... We'll see that these guys can occasionally, no offense apostles, you are great leaders of our church, could occasionally be a little tiresome. And you can see how Jesus might have thought, you all we need some food. All of you need to go buy some food here, and I need a little time alone, or with the Father. You can understand how Jesus might have set that up, and why. There's both a human and a divine reason. So, at any rate, Jesus finds himself alone. We've seen Jesus now ask the woman for a drink, because of course he doesn't have the means to get one himself. And now we see an interesting response, which initially, so she brings up, Jesus, you are a Jew, how is it that you're asking me for a drink? This can be seen as a racial thing from her, thinking there were different races and tons of stuff around that going on, and that's really not what's happening here. And thinking of that misses something significant about who this woman is and what her concern is. Jewish cleanliness and purification rules said that Jesus, a Jew, would be unclean if you shared a utensil with this Samaritan woman. So her concern is not, oh, you're a Jew and we don't like you, or you're a Jew and you don't like us. It is, at a deeper level, it's, I know you can't do this according to the rules of your religion, and I want to respect that, even though they're not the rules of my religion. Jesus asking for a drink, if he had been a Samaritan, no problem. If he'd have been a non-Jew foreigner, no problem. It makes total sense. He doesn't have the means of getting water, and he's thirsty, and here's somebody who does. Of course, she's going to share. Hospitality was a big deal still at this time. And she's not trying to not share water with him. She is actually legitimately showing concern for who Jesus is, as she's been able to perceive him, which is a Jew. It's a fascinating response. This woman is showing regard for a tradition that's not hers with no need to. She's not looking like she's creeped out by being kind of alone here with this guy, this strange guy. She's just saying, I don't think that's a good idea for you, right? Because you can't do that, right? And it's just checking. And we've seen and will continue to see in these encounters Jesus has with people that he responds to them as they come to him, which he also does to us, worth keeping in mind. Contrast, looking back at Nicodemus. Nicodemus started the whole exchange with something of a challenging tone. We, the Jewish leaders, clearly in a position of knowledge and authority, are coming to you, Jesus, for, I don't know what my question is, but I guess I need to check this out. I'm a little curious. No direct question. Certainly not willing to defer to you having any kind of greater authority than I do. Not really sure what I'm even looking for, and everything you're saying is confusing and disorienting, but I'm not going to give you the benefit of the doubt because I'm the expert. And we're going to have a conversation along the tone of continuing to insist that I'm the expert, which both Jesus and Nicodemus did. Jesus held Nicodemus to the standard of being an expert throughout that conversation because that's how Nicodemus came to him. And Jesus said things like, how can you, a teacher of the law, not understand this? You're claiming to be an expert. You're awfully oblivious for an expert. And again, he met Nicodemus as Nicodemus met him. Here we have a woman who is showing genuine concern for Jesus' religious background and practices and cleanliness. So how does Jesus respond to that concern? She's not even asking him a question. Other than just, I don't get how this can work, and showing some concern. They're certainly not talking about religion beyond that yet, although it necessarily brings it up. And he then responds with this odd statement. If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. Again, paralleling the conversation with Nicodemus. With Nicodemus, he throws out this odd and fairly incomprehensible idea of being born a second time, which thoroughly disorients Nicodemus and leads to an almost combative exchange around what can that mean. Nicodemus's response being, "Ha! That doesn't work. I know that's not possible. You're clearly not talking sense, Jesus," was kind of the tone of Nicodemus's response. This is also not exactly a thing that makes a lot of sense. Water is not alive. It's just not. And yet Jesus says, "I could have given you living water." This does not refer, by the way, to he could have made a stream of flowing water instead of stagnant water in a well up here. And he could have pulled something out of that. And we'll see she doesn't take it that way. So it's not just that it's running. That's not what we mean by living. That's a tempting interpretation because this doesn't make sense. But it's important for how this dialogue is progressing that we not try to easily resolve that this doesn't make sense, because it's meant to not make sense. But we see a fundamentally different response than what we saw from Nicodemus. Again, Nicodemus said, "Ha! People can't be born, re-enter their mother's wombs and be born a second time. That's crazy." She says, "Okay, living water. That, I don't know quite what that is, but it sounds appealing. I don't understand how you're going to do this. Again, you asked me for a drink because you didn't have any way of getting to the water in the well, and you're thirsty. Surely if you had the ability to access some water, this would have been a very different conversation." She's showing confusion, but not like obstinance. Not like this doesn't work. Like, I am not accepting this. She's actually showing a willingness to potentially accept and just a confusion. And then she shows the key thing, which is fascinating. So she places herself in the tradition of Jacob where the well is. "Are you greater than our father Jacob?" All of the Jews Jesus has interacted with thus far have insisted that at best Jesus had to be less great than the people who came before and the things that came before. And he had to be coming out of that tradition, but that tradition was king, and Jesus was at best just like another prophet within that tradition, not something greater than and capable of fundamentally changing it. She's hit the nail exactly on the head. And she's not saying that, like, "I don't think you are greater than Jacob." That's preposterous. She's actually asking, this well with this water that you're saying you can do better than, it goes back to Jacob. And, you know, he was a big deal to both of us. And are you saying that you can do a better thing than Jacob did? Because this was good enough for Jacob, this well and this water. And Jesus says, yeah, you know, everything that comes from Jacob, from Israel, from the Jews, and even from your ancestors, they all died and continue to die. This well, this water, that whole tradition, and everything that came from that is inadequate. It does not give life that lasts. And if it doesn't last, is it really life? If you're in the middle of dying all the time, are you really alive? We think so when we look at the world around us as, you know, this brief burst of life that then goes away. Jesus' point is, if it's always moving inevitably toward death, it's not alive. It's always intermingled with death. Just like you're always drinking and then you still have to drink again. You're always dying and you're just putting it off a little at a time, but death is inevitable. And so Jesus says, there's a different way. I have the ability to provide a thing that is different fundamentally from the background and tradition of Jacob. Again, you were worried about me and my cleanliness and my religious tradition. That doesn't matter to me because I have something superior to that. So I don't need to worry about these cleanliness rules because I am better than they are. Yes, I'm better than Jacob, greater than Jacob. Yes, I'm greater than Moses. Yes, I'm greater than David. Yes, I'm greater than the prophets. She asked, and he is willing to say, yes, I am greater than that. Everything that came from them was not able to make you or anyone else not dead. And I can and will, and if you ask me for that, I can make you not dead. When he talked with Nicodemus, he said people can be born of water and spirit. It's the same general idea. It's a new existence, a new reality that is a new life. What he didn't say to Nicodemus is, and I can give it to you. And he is saying that to this woman. Why? Again, because of the fundamental and difference in character and how these things are coming to pass. Nicodemus did not humble himself before Jesus, didn't admit that Jesus has anything that he needs, and certainly was not concerned really about who Jesus was so much as just trying to account for this guy and place him within what Nicodemus already understood of his tradition. This woman is instead concerned about the cleanliness of Jesus and willing to admit that he could be greater than everything that she knows. And so he is willing and able to be that for her. He won't exceed the scope that we limit him into in our lives. For Nicodemus, for this woman, for you or for me. If we put limits on who Jesus is, he won't go past those limits. He'll respect our autonomy in that regard. And so he will only be in our lives as much as we are willing to allow him to be in our lives. So a reflection from this, and an important one for all of us, is who are we letting Jesus be in our lives? Where are we limiting his ability to affect or to impact our lives? It's easy to create this narrow view of who Jesus is and what impact he's going to have on us, and he won't step outside of that scope. So just a thing to think and potentially pray on as we look at this. We also see the woman says, yes, I like the idea of that. She doesn't fully understand yet either. Nicodemus insisted on understanding before he could accept. And that also gets in his way. The woman here says, yeah, I would love to not have to come back to this well to draw water. Jesus isn't actually meaning that she's going to never have to come back to the well to draw water. She doesn't quite understand what he's talking about yet, but she's accepting it. St. Augustine famously said, I believe in order that I might understand. A concept in which faith precedes understanding, which is how it has to work. Again, faith ends up serving as another sense through which we can grasp or apprehend God in a way that we can't with our five senses and even our intellect, as it's limited by those five senses. So without faith, we can't truly perceive and apprehend God. So of course, we can't understand God. So Nicodemus, who tries to let understanding precede faith, runs into a wall where his understanding can't get him to faith because it can't. This woman, by contrast, is letting her faith lead her to understanding. She is accepting and trusting what Jesus is saying before she fully understands what that is. And we're going to see that that gets her much, much farther than Nicodemus is able to go. Which is our second thing to ponder and to reflect on here with this passage. Our world strongly likes to talk about believing in God. Like, I have to be able to understand and intellectually believe in God as the first step to my entry into religion. That is the pathway of Nicodemus. and that's one that leads us with pretty much insurmountable barriers, because by the light of our reason alone it is very, very difficult to come fully to an understanding and acceptance of God as He is, because we can't really see it. Because if faith has to come after understanding, we're never going to get to a point where we can see what we need to be seeing, how we need to be seeing it to understand. And the idea of faith, of belief in God being the first step on the way, is that pathway where we try to say that understanding will lead us to faith. And these couple of chapters back to back strongly tell us that does not work. Which is why you see so many people these days, especially and unfortunately of my generation, who have had it framed for them that that is how you come to religion, rejecting religion. Because they've tried to come through it through a path that is doomed to failure from the beginning. And so they end up not finding their way. Whereas instead, what this story suggests to us is that there is a different, superior, and effective way, but you have to start coming through faith, and then you can begin to understand. And if you don't come to Jesus through faith first, then you won't make it. So that's another thing to just generally think about in our own lives, and then this story is going to help also show us how we help bring that to other people here as we progress through this chapter. As we left off, this woman has said, yes, I want some of this living water because, I don't particularly enjoy coming to this well all the time. So she doesn't entirely understand what it is that she's looking for, but what she has fundamentally asked for is life, which is what Jesus has offered, and not this lame kind of life that we all think we're living that's actually a veiled form of death, but the real life that Jesus has to offer. On the way to what Jesus wants to give us, all of us have to come through the sin, the hurt, the pain of our lives to be able to come out on the other side. So it ends up not being, although it seems a little out of left field, it ends up not being too surprising where Jesus goes next. He asks this woman to bring her husband, and then she can have what she wants. From the text, we know not that much about her situation. We know she's had 5 husbands. She has a guy now who's not her husband. From that, we can assume or imagine quite a bit. She's clearly not had an easy life. Whether all of her previous husbands have died, or whether there has been divorce, which could happen back then, or even, since she's now with a guy who's not her husband, not divorced, and potentially following just with a guy when she's still technically married to another is entirely possible, although we don't know from the text either. But regardless, we know this is clearly an area of her life full of pain and not the most fun. And that's where Jesus immediately goes, because with her and with all of us, to give us the life that He has to give us, He needs to lead us through those trials and those sufferings and the sins of our lives. There's also note that as soon as she acknowledges, yes, okay, Jesus, it'd be easy to bring this guy I'm with here and tell you that he's my husband and get this living water you're trying to give me, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to tell you really what the situation is. I've had 5 husbands, the guy I'm with, not my husband. That could not have been an easy thing for her to just blurt out. Here's this guy that is offering her something she wants on a condition that she cannot meet, and she has to put forward a thing that very likely was a source of shame for her. And we see as soon as she does, Jesus is more than happy to move the conversation on. Jesus does not often, in my experience, respond to our sins and our failings the way we think he's going to. We project onto Jesus how we deal with those things for ourselves and, unfortunately, with others. Certainly, within the context of religion, there can be a lot of guilting and shaming of people. That's not what Jesus is doing, though. He wants to lead us through those things and offer us comfort and consolation and healing. Especially here when the woman came to him with this whole conversation, remember, was framed in the idea of purification and cleanliness. Her first being concerned for his, and now him being concerned for hers, because he meets people where they are. So he is moving through this, but he can't get her to the life she has said she wanted if she can't move through the areas of hurt and shame and sin in her life, just like he can't for us. And again, she's not limiting Jesus in scope in how he's acting here, like Nicodemus did, like we can. Jesus won't expand beyond where we let him be in our lives. She could very easily say, Jesus, this part of my life is none of your business. It's dirty, it's messy, it's unpleasant, stay out of it. Let's stay over here with the feel-good stuff and not get into the stuff that's messy. But that's not what she does. She invites him into all of her life. And at that point, he kind of, okay, that's on the table. You're right. Here's what I know about you, but we'll move on. I understand your situation. Thank you for acknowledging that a little bit. I'm not that concerned about it now that you've been willing to acknowledge that. We're going to move on. And she's actually the one then to change the tone of the conversation. Her response is, "Sir, I see that you are a prophet." And having seen that, she has now a question that has legitimately been weighing on her heart, that she's decided this Jesus guy is the real deal. And she asks, again, think about the difference in tone in how Nicodemus asks Jesus questions and how this woman is asking Jesus questions. Nicodemus is still very much at best in his head and is approaching Jesus that way. This is the burning question this woman has had about the worship of God, is there's a difference. Our people split, and for a long time, since just after Solomon, back to Jeroboam and Rehoboam, there's been this split between our people that led to a split in how we worship God, with the southern kingdom still maintaining and insisting that true worship of God comes in Jerusalem and in the holy city, and the northern kingdom saying, yeah, we've got our high places, it can be kind of wherever, and then getting compounded and worsened when other religions mixed in and other traditions. But in general, so this is a place where Jacob used to live. That's as good of a high place as any. You just climb up the hill and you worship God. And, we've talked a little bit about the idea, this is going up being where God is. So the inclination is still there, and this is still a thing rooted in the background of the people. You can see why they might have thought that was okay, especially after the split and them not wanting to give that level of authority to their brothers and sisters, ever more distantly so, to the south. But that would kind of be a nagging doubt over time. If you legitimately were interested in loving and serving God, you would have to have in the back of your mind this thought, is that holy city really, did they get it right? Did we get it wrong? What is the right way to worship God, because there are still those annoying things in the law that say 3 times a year you have to go to Jerusalem to pay your respect to God. So she asks, since you are a prophet, we have this difference about where this works, with the Israelites thinking holy place is fine, and the Judahites, now Jews, insisting on Jerusalem. Jesus, which is it? And he says something interesting. Neither. That is not at all the answer she was expecting. She assumed one or the other was right. And now we see again a continuation of what Jesus has been doing. He's made himself, or John has made him, but he's accepted being the Lamb of God. He's let himself be this bronze serpent. Now we're going to see, although it's not quite clear yet, this is where we're going, that he also becomes the real, true mountain of God. The place where humanity meets God. That is Jesus. That is the incarnation. Human and God are met together in the incarnation of Jesus Christ in a way that is much more profoundly true than on any mountain, even Jerusalem. So Jesus is very much setting the stage for him, not Jerusalem, being where true worship happens. And so he tells her, it's coming up, that neither one of those is going to be right. He says, you all have lost sight of, you don't actually know God. The Jews do. He doesn't say they're better than you for that. Just they've gotten this part more right. But more right, not right. Just like Nicodemus may have had more background in terms of the law by far than this woman does, makes him more knowledgeable, but what does that avail him when met with Jesus? Very little. In the face of this new thing, in fact, that serves as a barrier and an obstacle for him. He can't get past what it is that he already knows to get to there's a new thing. But salvation is from the Jews. That is an important line thrown in here, as Jesus seems mostly in contradiction to the Jews through all of this gospel, that it's still from he's in contradiction to the Jews, but not Judaism. He's making himself the fulfillment of all of these things in their tradition. What he's doing is flowing from and out of that. So if he's in conflict with the leaders, he's not in conflict with the teaching. Again, the thing he brings to fulfillment, the people, can be very problematic. And that continues to happen here. So we see salvation is from the Jews is a very important thing to keep in mind. He is picking sides in terms of who has been more right. But we'll leave all of that behind us too, and we're doing a new thing. And that new thing isn't just for the Jews, even if it's from the Jews. He doesn't say salvation is for the Jews, he says salvation is from the Jews. But moving forward, we're not going to worship the Father on any hills. We don't need that anymore. Because the point of the hill was, where does God encounter humanity? Or where can humanity get close to God? Well, in spirit and truth, humanity gets close to God. Not in terms of physical proximity, but in terms of who we are. As we live in the truth and allow the Spirit in to dwell in and to move us, we draw nearer internally in terms of who we are to God. And that is, of course, what all of these other high places were intending to foreshadow. Because we know now we don't go up in airplanes to pray to God. We've moved past that. We know it's a spiritual and not a worldly thing. But I think that's the thing that we can take for granted now as, oh, of course, there's this abstract spiritual thing at work, and we don't need to worry about physically where we're located. In taking it for granted, we potentially also lose the thrust of what that is and what that means. To worship God, we still have to draw near to God. It's not enough I can be wherever I want, walking in the woods, sitting on my couch, in a church, wherever. Location is irrelevant, but I have to draw near to God internally, both in how I'm living my life and then in my own disposition and orientation when I pray and worship God. I'm not excused from being near to God. I'm just supposed to do it differently. But not at all. I don't get that it's not God is everywhere and I can be and do whatever I want and it'll work. That's not at all what's happened. I still have to be near to God to worship God. I've just been invited to a different form of doing that. And again, faith is that thing that directionally draws us in the direction of toward God. It's through still faith and love that we draw near to God. And so that pathway is still here, but we still have to do that, or we're not worshiping God correctly. Jesus didn't do away with a rule and then not put a different one in place. He just changed it. And that's coming and is now here. How does he get to say it's now here? It's because it's him. It's Jesus. So it both is here and is coming, in that the new mountain of God is physically present in the world in Jesus. It's also coming in that the Spirit is not totally yet available at all to anyone who's not Jesus until the end of this whole story. So it is coming and is now here, but it's not yet fully available for everyone while Jesus is engaged in his public ministry. So he can say both, it's here and it's coming, and both are correct. After this talk about worship, with a strong suggestion that it's through Jesus that we gain access to the Spirit and to this new kind of worship, the woman started with, I see you are a prophet. Now, after this surprising answer to her question, she's saying, so there's this Messiah thing that you people believe in. Again, her ancestors would not have been thrilled with the idea of a Davidic king coming, since they were from the line not of David. So the Messiah is not really a Samaritan thing or an Israelite thing. They would not, in fact, be particularly interested in the idea of a Davidic Messiah coming. Nonetheless, this woman here is saying, but there's a lot of talk about this Messiah thing. I know that there might be such a thing. And then she takes a departure. She's not seeing Messiah as David, as king. She says, what does she say the Messiah will do? He will show us all things. That's an unusual view of Messiah. And it's within that unusual view, she's not saying David is coming back. She's not saying we want a king to free us from the Romans. When she sees Messiah as someone who will reveal God to the people, then Jesus says, yes, that I am. I'm not David, because he was imperfect and I am. I'm not Moses, because he was imperfect and I am. I am this Messiah that you see, the one who will show God to the world. That I can say I am, because that I am. So I may tell all of these other people that I'm not the things they're looking for, and that is a true answer. but I can tell you that I am the thing you're asking about, because you're using the same word to ask about a very different thing. And you've actually identified what I am. So yes, he's not trying to deny ever that he is from God or that he's the Messiah. He's just not trying to let people pigeonhole him into a thing that he's not. And he will say, I am not that, when they ask about something silly. But she has, again, how does she see Jesus this way? It's through the eyes of faith. She has acted and seen with faith beyond what anything she should have understood about the Messiah would have said or suggested. She's seen something fundamental about the character of Jesus that is really very profound, and Jesus identifies himself with that. There's a very interesting parallel here with something that happens in the Synoptic Gospels, where Jesus asks his followers, who do you say that I am? And a different person gets a great deal of credit for understanding a similar thing about the Messiah, and that is Peter. But here in John's Gospel, the similar identification of Jesus comes from the mouth of a non-Jewish woman rather than the foremost of Jesus' followers, which says a lot about a lot of things in John's Gospel. It's kind of just an interesting thing that is worth keeping in mind. But why is that? Both in the Synoptics, faith has shown that to Peter, and here we see faith coming from tremendous and significant faith coming from not a Jew, and not a man, but from this Samaritan woman, which again highlights, or should highlight, Jesus comes for everyone, and everyone can find and recognize Jesus. In good dramatic fashion, Jesus' followers come back right as Jesus has managed to finish his conversation with this woman. And they are understandably a little confused and maybe concerned. Jesus here is hanging out with and talking with this woman. What does he want? What is he doing? Well, you all left him here without any means of getting a drink of water. He was thirsty, but beyond that, this is what Jesus will see. Jesus will explain what he was doing. They're also not willing to ask. And we get yet another comparison. These guys, who are kind of professionally following Jesus at this point, managed to make it into and out of town, and there's no real strong suggestion that really they were talking about Jesus much while they were in town. They were just going shopping. Whereas this woman who was there to draw water gets so excited, she leaves her water jar there, her original purpose completely forgotten, and the realities and necessities of life, food, water, doesn't matter anymore. There's a more important thing to do. And she hurries back to town and says to everybody, I met this guy. Can he be the Christ? Not even, I think he is, but just, could he be? And gets everybody to come out to meet Jesus. Jesus' disciples weren't going into town and getting everybody to come out to meet Jesus. They were just getting dinner. And then they were concerned about what Jesus was up to. Again, contrast. And I'm not trying to make it sound like these guys are a bunch of losers, right? We know they're the church. They're the guys Jesus picked. But it can be easy when following Christ becomes a normal part of our life to start carving out portions that are, this is dinner time, this isn't Jesus time. You know, we've been doing this Jesus thing, now he's giving us time off to go get dinner. There's a part of my life that doesn't involve having to worry about this whole Jesus thing. And I think it's very easy when you're all in and you've been doing it for a while to settle into having your Jesus times and your non-Jesus times, or places or activities or whatever. And it's a thing that sort of happens. Whereas this woman is fresh and excited. And so she definitely has an advantage here in that this is all new to her. So it's not entirely a fair comparison, but there is a challenge to us in terms of looking at how much are we separating from Jesus in our lives, and are those things really appropriate to be pushing Jesus out of or separating from Jesus? Probably sometimes yes, maybe sometimes no. But again, the contrast is just an interesting thing to think about. But the woman definitely looks far more on fire with this whole Jesus idea at this point than Jesus' followers. And her response to having met Jesus is to say, I think everybody else would like to do this as well. Now that Jesus' followers have come back, of course they went for dinner, so now they're very eager that Jesus should eat some of the food that they brought back. And again we see Jesus offering a relatively perplexing statement. Framing the context, Jesus just had a long conversation with a woman about getting a drink of water, which all evidence suggests he never actually drank. Although he started asking for it and potentially she gave him a drink while they were in the middle of their conversation, we don't know that he ever actually drank the water. But in that case, he at least seemed interested. Here, they seem very interested in getting him to eat, and he seems very much disinclined. Toward the point of suggesting that one ought to labor toward something else. I think we can now separate labor and the need to eat more than they did back then. You know, I work and I get an abstract number deposited into a digital account that then ends up being loosely connected to a different digital account with a piece of plastic that I swipe and people give me food. And those levels of abstraction make it seem like I'm not just doing labor to get food. Back then it was much more easily connected that you work in order to eat. And so the connection here between labor and food is more urgent and more visceral than it would be for us, but it's one that's worth focusing on. What is Jesus saying then? When he says we should labor for things other than to eat, he's fundamentally suggesting, again, there's a different meaning to life. He's again highlighting a different kind of living than people were used to, and saying, if you're going to try to live the life that I'm offering you, then you are not working to eat. You're not working to sustain this fleshy thing. There's a whole other thing that has to become the focus of what it is that you're doing. As importantly and as urgently as you are right now working to eat. So when all of you thought the most important thing was running into town to get dinner, I stayed and I talked to this woman about God. And and through her, look at what all is happening. That is priority number one from now on, far and above any kind of how you're used to viewing how you live and how you work. So he's turning this very much into a lesson for his followers as well. And then he suggests, again, in the context of, he talks about this labor still in the context of harvesting food, is, look, you worry about the food harvest when it's seasonal, and you say, yeah, it's not time for that yet. That's fine, but this other harvest, it's always time. It's here, it's ready, it's available right now. There are people who are ready to receive what we're trying to do. In fact, a whole bunch of them are on their way or already here because of what that woman is right now saying to people. So it's go time right now. We've got a lot we can do to talk about God to all of these people who are ready from the work that this woman did, from the work that, by the way, I did while all of you were worried about being hungry. Again, this is probably not so much scolding his followers as it is teaching, saying there are other things that are more important than the things that you think are important. He does seem to think that they'll be open to that idea. And do we let Jesus suggest the same for us? It's very easy, especially in the context of work and some other things, for us to decide this is the most important thing, and then I'll work in Jesus. And the call, as always, is that has to be first. Working for Jesus and his kingdom is, if that's not the first thing, then it's nothing. And it's very easy for us to place other priorities ahead of that. Jesus' disciples are not unique in that. And where they have a leg up on many of us is they seem to get the message. For sure they eventually do. And come around. There's also one other thing worth thinking about here from the point of view of others who've worked in your harvesting. It's not just this woman is bringing a bunch of people to us that we're going to be able to talk about, although that is one sense of it. There is also the sense of all of the history of the Old Testament, all of the prophets, all of the law. Everything is prepared a people and beyond for this new thing that's coming about. There are a ton of people who are ready to receive what Jesus is bringing, but they need someone to go harvest what has been planted long before. And there are still a lot of people who are deeply craving or longing for something more than what they know, and would be open to receiving it if we could bring it to them, and again, the right way. And we'll talk just a little bit farther into this passage about what that right way looks like. Again, bearing in mind that there's a right and a wrong way to come to Jesus. If there's a right and a wrong way to come to Jesus, there's a right and a wrong way to bring Jesus to someone. We'll see that here in a little bit as well. All of these various people from the village come out based on what the woman has said. Could this be the Messiah? And they come out and they get to know Jesus. And from their own account, they started coming out to meet Jesus because of what she had said. And then they meet Jesus for themselves, and now it no longer matters what she had said. They believe because they've met Jesus themselves. That's a beautiful image for how the transmission of faith can and should work. I personally have met Jesus. I tell someone about that and let them get to know Jesus in and through me enough to raise curiosity. And then I bring those people to meet Jesus themselves. And from there, it's between them and Jesus. That is, making an introduction is a great analogy for the transmission of faith. Within that context, we are not trying to tell someone everything about Jesus. You can, especially with social media and the internet being what it is, we can now get to know a lot about someone without getting to know someone. And I think it can be tempting to try to get to know about Jesus the same way, to learn a lot about him without ever getting to know him. Again, keeping it kind of in the headspace like Nicodemus was doing. A lot of people read the Bible without ever actually trying to get to know Jesus and come away relatively unmoved, and not surprisingly. And so when we work to evangelize, to spread the good news of Jesus, we're not doing it, we should not be doing it by saying, let me teach you all the things about the faith and about Jesus. Because you can learn a lot about Jesus without ever knowing Jesus. And again, you can get stuck in that trying to come to faith through understanding. And it just doesn't work. What the woman does, if she leads people, she doesn't try to tell them everything herself. She tells them just enough to say, I met this guy you should really meet, and he's right outside of town. Let me take you to him. And she does that. That is the model for how evangelization should work, is I want to tell you just enough and show you just enough that I can get you to come with me to where Jesus is. And then you can meet him for yourself, because he's the one who's going to do the work of evangelizing you. My job is just to get you to him, rather than to tell you about him. And I think sometimes we potentially miss the point on that, and then wonder why it's not necessarily that effective. This is a perfect story highlighting what good and effective evangelization looks like. After a warm reception in this particular village in Samaria, Jesus moves on with his journey. Again, he had been journeying, and you can look at the maps and study for more context, but he had been journeying north from Jerusalem. He was headed through Samaria. That was not his end point. So we have this interlude along the way that again serves as a comparison, not only with how he was received in Jerusalem, but also how he is received once he gets back home. So we set this up. The people from Galilee had also been at the feast, some of them, and had seen a lot of the things that Jesus was doing, and they are initially at least excited about the idea of Jesus coming home. But it's set up, a prophet has no honor in his own country. So we're setting up this homecoming of Jesus with the idea that it's probably not going to go nearly as smoothly as this random stop in Samaria. Once Jesus arrives, word spreads. He is, whether he wants to be or not, developing quite a reputation. And again, this is, as the text tells us, where he had made water into wine. So his first major sign was here. He would be especially famous here anyway, and word certainly would have spread. And now Jesus has his third conversation in a row with someone, here an official, whose son is ill and at the point of death. The first, Nicodemus, came to Jesus with an odd sense of curiosity mixed with an air of, let's make sure we all understand that we, the Jewish leaders, are still in charge and figure out how you fit into that. Then there was the Samaritan woman where Jesus started the conversation. Woman, give me a drink. And now this guy is also seeking Jesus out. And more so than either of them is looking for a very particular and specific thing from Jesus. All three of these encounters end up being about people seeking the same thing from Jesus, whether they know they want it or not. Life. Nicodemus, he talked about through imagery of baptism, new birth, he talked about the idea of life. Though it was kind of lost on Nicodemus, and Nicodemus didn't really know that's what he was looking for, that's still where the conversation went. Same with the woman at the well. Again, the conversation quickly turned to living water and her wanting it. It was all about life again, although again, Jesus led the conversation there. This one starts directly with the topic of life brought up by the official, but not his life. And again, maybe not life like Jesus is talking about it, but it's an interesting kind of build from those other conversations that it gets there more directly. Why is the official asking Jesus this demanding need? If your son is dying, you'll likely do anything to try to save that. He's coming to Jesus as a result of the signs and the wonders that Jesus has done. Have created enough buzz that needing a similar thing, he's thinking, I should try Jesus. So Jesus starts his interaction here saying, hey, unless you people see this stuff, you won't believe. First of all, is that true? There's no strong suggestion that this official actually saw the water become wine. We don't know that he was at the wedding. It's likely he wasn't. But he has heard about it. So seeing and hearing, there's a difference here. He's not in the category of people who have seen and have believed. And he doesn't see. He comes to Jesus as a result of what he has heard. And Jesus ultimately tells him, you can go, your son will live. And he again accepts what he has heard. So Jesus, almost criticism here, you all have to see in order to believe, doesn't actually relate to the guy that he's saying it to. Because this guy is fine hearing and doesn't need to see. He's fine being a level removed from that testimony. And even when people come to him and tell him, your son is healed, he believes. He doesn't say, get me home right now, I need to see that for myself. He says, great, praise God. So Jesus bringing up that idea of, again, the senses are so important in this gospel, and the difference between, and the relationship between the senses that we normally are familiar with and these other different senses, seeing by faith instead of by eyes. And here Jesus is pointing out this seeing with our eyes, that's not how you all need to be doing that. You're thinking that that's going to get you to faith, all of you, and it doesn't. It's a problem. But the guy he's directly talking to is not afflicted with that problem. He does not need to see with his eyes in order, he is able to see with faith. Jesus is actually talking to someone who is willing and able to, again, show that faith is what Jesus is going for. It works out very well for him. So in this is a caution, but also something pointing us in the direction of what Jesus is really looking for. Can we see without our eyes? Can we see with faith who Jesus is and what he can do? Ultimately, this man ends up being proof of, or demonstration of what that faith does look like and should look like. from that comes a sign, another sign from Jesus. Also in response to a direct request. The two signs in Cana of Galilee that we've seen, the first one came certainly from a request made in faith from Jesus' mother, and the second one also comes from a request made in faith from this man. There seems to be, so far, a strong connection between direct, faithful requests made to Jesus and his willingness to oblige. You could even say his interaction with this woman right before was characterized by a similar thing. Sir, give me this water always. She did also make a request, and he did also grant it. It just didn't come with a sign or a wonder, but it probably did come with some kind of working of Jesus, just not one that really is visible. Again, fascinatingly, this man's faith and not needing to see led to a visible sign of God's power for other people. It doesn't matter to him at all. He fully accepted that this had happened without ever seeing it himself. But then from that, other people also get to see the power and the working of God. And Jesus is certainly willing to do that. But he seems, in the working of these things, to be looking for someone involved who accepts the working with faith in order to make it happen. Not that that's required, but that is how he is choosing to operate, is in response to someone else's act of faith. He will do a thing that is extraordinary. If you're going to limit Jesus to the sensible things of the world, he won't step beyond that. He'll stay in whatever container we choose to put him in, and whatever shape that is the shape he'll take. But if we limit him to sensible things, he won't act outside of those. But if we say that, acknowledge and treat him as greater than those sensible things, then he will also act accordingly. So there's that reflection for all of us, as well as, again, and it'll keep coming around throughout the early part of this gospel. The first half or so is, how are we coming to Jesus in our own lives? What limits are we placing on him? And what can we do to open more and more ourselves to the working of Jesus in our lives? This has been an overview of Lesson 5 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study, The Gospel According to John, an encounter with grace and truth. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.